above this blue line first. Okay. So if you guys can recall, when we did our respiratory system and we talked about how carbon dioxide travels in the bloodstream, right? So we're still back to the chemical buffer. We're not talking about respiratory buffer yet, chemical buffer, okay? In your red blood cells, right? In hemoglobin, your normal cells oxidize glucose, break down glucose, right? And so what happens is the glucose gets broken down into carbon dioxide and water. So here's your cell. Your cell is going through glycolysis, breaking down glucose into carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide diffuses out of the cell membrane from the tissue, and it enters into the blood vessels, the capillaries, right? And then within the blood capillaries, it then has to diffuse into the red blood cell, right? Yeah. And remember that within the red blood cell, you have an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase.
Yes.
And that carbonic anhydrase catalyzes a reaction in which carbon dioxide combines with water to form carbonic acid. This is all review from respiratory system, right? The carbonic acid then can dissociate to form hydrogen ions and bicarb, right? So the tissue, in the blood vessels of the tissue, you've got hemoglobin that just came from the lungs, and the hemoglobin is bound to oxygen. Now that oxygen, when it gets to the tissue, gets displaced because hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen went down. So oxygen got displaced, oxygen left the hemoglobin, and now the hemoglobin is without oxygen, so it's deoxyhemoglobin, right? That deoxyhemoglobin then can bind to the hydrogen that was released from the carbonic acid, binds to the hydrogen, and in doing so, it minimizes any pH change that occurs, okay? In the lungs, the affinity for oxygen, hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen goes up. So now hemoglobin wants oxygen, right? So when that hemoglobin that bound to hydrogen in the tissues reached the lung, that hemoglobin bound to the hydrogen will release the hydrogen. Okay, when it releases the hydrogen, that hemoglobin is now, it's deoxy without the hydrogen, it binds to the oxygen to form oxygenated hemoglobin, right? But that hydrogen that is released in the lungs can then combine to the bicarb to form carbonic acid, and the carbonic acid can then break down into water and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide gets exhaled, and the water is added to the body's fluids. Okay, so this is just kind of reasoning back out the bicarb system, the bicarb buffer, okay? And how, because we said the chemical buffers occurs inside the cell as well as outside the cell, and outside the cell it's occurring in the bloodstream, right? So this is all happening in the bloodstream, okay? Any questions? So now we want to talk about, so we went through the chemical buffers, and what were the three chemical buffers? Protein buffer, bicarb buffer, and phosphate buffers. And these were first-line defenses against changes in pH, right? It happens within seconds. These buffers happen within seconds. And they occur inside the cell as well as outside the cell, okay? Now we're going to be talking about physiologic buffers. Yes?
With that example, would that be part of the bicarb or protein?
It's a part of the bicarb buffer system.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so physiologic buffers here. The physiologic buffer here. So we were talking about chemical versus physiologic buffer. The physiologic buffer is a second-line buffering system, second-line defense system. It takes longer to respond than the chemical buffer. Okay, there's two main ways that we deal with excess acid when the chemical buffer doesn't fully fix the job, right? And so what happens is the two main physiologic buffer systems are the renal and respiratory. So respiratory on this side, renal on this side, okay? The respiratory system deals mainly with carbon dioxide, with excreting carbon dioxide. We talked about carbon dioxide buildup as being acidic. So when you've got too much acid, you can get rid of the carbon dioxide and thereby get rid of excess acid, okay? The renal system mainly deals with hydrogen ions. Okay, we'll talk about that later, but let's start with the respiratory system. So, in the lung, you've got respiratory centers located specifically in the brainstem that regulate the concentration of hydrogen ions within your body's fluids by controlling the rate and the depth of your breathing. Okay, in the brainstem, controlling the rate and depth of your breathing. So we've got two examples here. Okay, imagine you've got cells that are making carbon dioxide and water. If your cells make too much of the carbon dioxide and water, because we're thinking these processes, these metabolic processes yield more acids than bases, right? They make too much acid, too much carbon dioxide, then what happens is that carbon dioxide combines with water to form carbonic acid. The carbonic acid then breaks down into bicarb and hydrogen ions. So now you have an excess of hydrogen ions in your body. That excess of hydrogen ions can be detected in the CSF, right, up in the brain, in the CSF, and that will then stimulate chemoreceptors, right? Stimulates chemoreceptors in the respiratory center to increase the depth and rate of breathing. If you breathe faster, right, and deeper, what happens is you blow out more CO2, right? If you blow out more CO2, the amount of CO2 left over in your body goes down. If the amount of CO2 left over in your body goes down, then your acid-base level normalizes back to normal because you become less acidic, right? Hydrogen ion concentration normalizes. What happens if we have the opposite occur? So if you have low, low production of carbon dioxide by your cells, then you have low carbon dioxide in your body. Low carbon dioxide in your body, if we go through this whole system again, right? This is the ... Go through the whole system again. Low carbon dioxide in your body equals low hydrogen ion concentration in your body. Low hydrogen ion concentration in your body will be detected by the respiratory centers and stimulates the respiratory centers to decrease the rate and depth of breathing. When you decrease your rate and depth of breathing, you lose less carbon dioxide. If you lose less carbon dioxide, you accumulate carbon dioxide within your body's fluids. Okay? The carbon dioxide excess will then normalize the pH because you become more acidic. So normalize the pH. Okay? So therefore, the activity of your respiratory center, any changes, the activity of the respiratory centers will change in response to shifts in the pH, and it reduces the shift to a minimum, so it minimizes any shifts. Most hydrogen ions are from carbonic acid production by the carbon dioxide combining with the water, okay? And so therefore, the respiratory regulation is very important.
Is that from or for at the bottom? Most times now.
From.
From. Did I say for?
No, you said from.
From. So that's the lung. So again, key point is the lung deals with carbon dioxide. The lung deals with just carbon dioxide. You either release more carbon dioxide or you retain more carbon dioxide, but it deals with mainly carbon dioxide, okay? The kidneys deal with hydrogen ions. The kidneys deal with hydrogen ions, the lung deals with carbon dioxide, okay? Now, where does it deal with the hydrogen ions? It deals with it at the proximal convoluted tubule and the distal convoluted tubule. Most absorption occurs at the proximal convoluted tubule, but there are some absorption that occurs at the distal convoluted tubule as well, and there's secretion that occurs at both sides, okay? So proximal convoluted tubule and distal convoluted tubule will secrete ions into the tubular fluid, which is the urine that's being made, right? And at these sites, two processes are linked together, okay? We secrete hydrogen ions and we reabsorb bicarb. So again, remember, most metabolic processes yield more acids than bases. So you have too much acid, you're trying to get rid of acid. One way of getting rid of acid is releasing the acid, releasing the hydrogen ions, and another way of dealing with the acid is neutralizing that acid by increasing base, right? So we release hydrogen ions while reabsorbing bicarb. Bicarb was base. So these two are linked together at these sites. Okay? So here's an example. Let's say we have a high protein diet, take in a lot of protein, right? The protein gets broken down, so metabolism of certain amino acids in the protein diet will yield production of sulfuric acid and phosphoric acid. The kidney will compensate by secreting this excess acid. And the way it does it is, if we think about the nephron, right? Here's your bloodstream on this side. Here's the renal tubule and the Bowman's capsule here. The phosphate that's in your blood, in all this protein that we've absorbed into your body, right? The phosphate then gets filtered at the renal corpuscle and enters into the renal tubule, right? That phosphate will then filter that filtrate that was filtered, right? That phosphate that was filtered that can then buffer the hydrogen ion secretion. Again, phosphate buffer. It's another way of thinking about the phosphate buffer. The phosphate that gets filtered can buffer the secretion of the hydrogen ions. And also, this process is aided by ammonia. So this is the description of the ammonia aiding this. So here's your renal tubule. Here's the Bowman's capsule. Imagine the cells that line the walls of the renal tubule. These are cells lining the wall. Okay. So deamination of amino acids. You take out ammonia, right? Deamination of amino acids. That means ammonia is taken out. NH3 is taken out. So you're producing NH3. That NH3 can diffuse from these cells, diffuse across the cell membrane to enter into the renal tubule. Okay? So if you're secreting, right here, you're secreting hydrogen ions into the renal tubule. The hydrogen ions can then combine with the ammonia that was formed through the deamination of amino acids by these cells, right? So these two combine together to form ammonium. So the ammonia is a weak base, the ammonium is a weak acid, okay? So these two combine together to form this. Cell membranes that line these renal tubules are impermeable to the ammonium, okay? And because it's impermeable to the ammonium, when the ammonia can diffuse across, but once it forms ammonium, the ammonium cannot come back.
Right.
So it's trapping that ammonium inside the renal tubule so that it can be excreted out as urine. Okay. Why is this important? It prevents the urine from becoming too acidic. Because this is strong acid. This can be strong acid, but when it combines with a weak base, it becomes a weak acid. So it minimizes the acidity that's formed in the urine. Okay? And it also is a way of forcing more acid out. Okay? Any questions? Yes?
So in the filtration part,
Yes.
Where does the phosphate come from?
The phosphate is in our bloodstream, so imagine.
I remember one is like from the calcium, right? When the calcium process.
Right.
dump phosphate there.
Any phosphates in our body, right here, this is the example given from the proteins.
Oh, okay.
Right?
When you break down
When you break down proteins from your diet, it can form sulfuric acid, it can form phosphoric acid.
and those have phosphates.
Those have phosphates in them, and the phosphate
Okay.
helps with the buffering.
And then another question I had was the deamination of amino acids.
Mhm.
Why does that occur?
So it normally it's a part of the metabolic processes
So
of your body.
It just has to happen when it goes through. into
Right.
the-
So deamination occurs in these areas,
Oh,
and when deamination occurs here, you have ammonia, and ammonia can diffuse across.
okay.
If you don't have acid in this area, it can diffuse back, right? So
Okay.
it kind of goes back and forth. If you have acid in this area, it combines with the acid and it traps that
Okay.
acid.
I
Yeah.
see.
Oh.
Okay. Any other questions?